Welcome to today's Explainer. We're stepping back into a world that honestly gets unfairly dismissed as the Dark Ages. But as we're going to see today, the Anglo-Saxon period was anything but dark. It was actually a deeply dynamic crucible of clashing cultures, and it forged the very foundations of the English language and literature as we know it.
A solitary exile, mourning his lost lord and kin, meditating on the impermanence of earthly glory. That haunting line is from the Old English elegy, The Wanderer, and it really perfectly sets up the world we're about to explore. This was a world filled with absolutely bloody, heroic, monster battles, but also this deep, poetic melancholy.
So, let's dive right in. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. An island of invasions. 2. Kings, warriors, and monks. 3. The birth of Old English. 4. Epics, elegies, and battles. And finally, 5. The surviving manuscripts.
Section 1. An island of invasions. A vulnerable prize. Okay, to truly understand Anglo-Saxon literature, we first got to wrap our heads around the geopolitics of Britain at the time. It was an island under constant siege. The native Celtic people were just repeatedly conquered. First, the Romans arrived around 43 BCE, bringing roads and towns and all that infrastructure. But then, in 410 CE, Rome completely withdrew to deal with its own collapse. And that left Britain entirely vulnerable. Almost immediately, around 449 CE, Germanic tribes swept in. Then, a few centuries later in the 8th century, those terrifying Viking raids began. And finally, this whole era abruptly ended in 1066 with the Battle of Hastings, when the French-speaking Normans took over. We're talking about over 600 years of constant, violent turnover.
Now, what's super interesting is how those Germanic settlers organized themselves. They didn't just form one united country right off the bat. Instead, they formed 7 distinct kingdoms, collectively known as the Heptarchy. You've got Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, Kent, and Wessex. And these kingdoms were pretty much constantly fighting each other for dominance, with Wessex eventually emerging as the absolute powerhouse.
So, who were these Germanic invaders? They were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And here's a fun fact. The very term England actually comes from the Angles. It was England land, literally the land of the Angles. As these tribes moved in, they violently pushed the native Celtic Britons to the western and northern fringes. And that's exactly why Celtic culture survived in places like modern-day Wales, Scotland, and Ireland.
Section 2. Kings, Warriors, and Monks. Two worlds collide.
Those physical invasions obviously changed the map, but they also brought about this massive ideological collision. On one side, you have the pagan heroic ethos. Think of a patriarchal, honor-based tribal society. They valued loyalty to their king above absolutely anything else, bravery in battle, and seeking fame so their name would outlast death. They also had this overriding belief in a dark, inescapable fate called weird. But then, on the other side, starting around 597 CE with St. Augustine, the Christian worldview starts sweeping in. And this brought monasteries as centers of learning, the promise of scriptural salvation, and crucially, written literacy. This clash is the core tension of the Anglo-Saxon era, and it's totally vital for understanding why their heroes act the way they do.
But here's the really crucial point. These two seemingly incompatible worldviews didn't just destroy each other. They merged. This process is called syncretism. It's the blending of that gritty pagan warrior culture with Christian theology, and it created the incredibly unique flavor of early English society and its literature.
Section 3. The birth of Old English. A puzzle of words.
And speaking of that literature, the language itself is just a fascinating linguistic puzzle. Old English was heavily Germanic, sure, but it was sprinkled with Latin, Old Norse, and Celtic. And their poetry, completely different from what we're used to today. They didn't use rhyme at all. Instead, it was an oral tradition kept alive by traveling bards called scopes. To help remember thousands of lines of verse, these scopes relied on strict structure and these beautiful puzzle-like metaphors called kennings.
Imagine being a scop constructing a poem on the fly. Instead of just saying the sea, you'd use a kinning like whale road. Instead of the body, you'd say bone house. They paired these highly visual metaphors with intense alliteration, repeating those starting consonant sounds, and something called a caesura, which is a hard, distinct pause right in the middle of a line. These rhythmic, formulaic phrases were basically the ultimate memory hacks for performing epic tales around a fire in a crowded meat hall.
Section 4. Epics, elegies, and battles. The literature forged in fire.
These stories they told were literally forged in the fire of their harsh reality. And we really can't talk about Anglo-Saxon literature without talking about Beowulf, the oldest surviving English epic. It's a tragic, fate-driven story of a Geatish prince who travels over to Denmark to help King Hrothgar. The whole narrative is structured around 3 legendary battles. Step 1. Beowulf defeats the monster Grendel in brutal hand-to-hand combat, literally tearing the monster's arm off. Step 2. He dives into a blood-stained underwater cave to kill Grendel's mother with a giant, magical sword. And step 3. 50 years pass. Beowulf is an old king now, and he has to fight a fire-breathing dragon. With the help of a young warrior named Wiglaf, they defeat the beast, but Beowulf is mortally wounded. He leaves his people vulnerable. It perfectly captures that pagan heroic ethos we talked about, seeking glory before an inevitable, fated death.
But you know, they didn't just write about glorious monster battles. Let's look at their elegiac poetry. These were deeply sorrowful lyric monologues. You've got the wanderer mourning his dead lord, the seafarer using the freezing, harsh ocean as a metaphor for spiritual loneliness. There's the wife's lament, which is a really rare female perspective, expressing longing for her exiled husband from a literal cave under an oak tree. And the ruin, which is just this pure, melancholy reflection on staring at the crumbling stone walls of an abandoned Roman city. These poems prove that 1,000 years ago, people felt the exact same deep sense of isolation, heartbreak, and anxiety about the future that we do today.
Yet, even in the face of all that loss, their warrior spirit remained totally defiant. Just take this quote from J.R.R. Chokeen's translation of The Battle of Maldon. "Will shall be the sterner, heart the bolder, spirit the greater, as our strength lessens." This was written about a real historical battle in 991 CE against Viking invaders. And it's basically the ultimate expression of Anglo-Saxon courage, right? Standing your ground and fighting harder even when you know for a fact you're completely doomed.
Section 5. The Surviving Manuscripts. Rescuing the Legacy.
Now, for all this incredible culture, none of it would even exist for us to read today if it weren't for the physical manuscripts and the leaders who rescued them. We owe a massive debt to King Alfred the Great of Wessex. He wasn't just a military genius who defeated the Vikings, built fortresses, and established the first English navy. The guy was a cultural visionary. He established the Danelaw boundary to keep the Vikings contained, and then he immediately set to work saving English culture. He started the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to record their history. He actively sponsored translating Latin books into Old English, and alongside him, we have to remember early religious poets like Cædmon and Cynewulf, who blended that new Christian faith with the traditional illiterate diverse, preserving the language's poetic power.
Because honestly, despite Alfred's best efforts, time, fire, and war took a massive toll. It is absolutely mind-blowing to realize that almost all surviving Old English poetry is contained in just these 4 fragile manuscript collections. You have the Junius manuscript, which holds the religious epics. The Exeter book contains all those beautiful, sorrowful elegies we just talked about. The Vercelli book, which somehow ended up in Italy, contains the Dream of the Rood. And the Nawal Codex is the sole surviving document that contains the story of Beowulf. Literally just 4 books, holding the entire poetic legacy of a 600-year civilization.
So, think about this. From Beowulf diving into a monster's lair, to J.R.R. Tolkien drawing directly from these exact texts to create Middle-earth, right? Up to the Marvel superheroes on our screens today, are we still just telling the exact same heroic stories that were forged by the Anglo-Saxons around their mead hall fires? Keep that in mind the next time you watch a hero face down an impossible fate. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.